Things, ideas, or actions that are included in categories share features in common with other members of those categories. If some members of a category share additional features that are not common to the category as a whole, they are sometimes grouped together in a subcategory, which is in turn given a category label of its own. Such categories will always have fewer members than the wider category of which they form a part, but those members have more features in common than do the members of the larger category. In video 4, we said that when categories are related in this way, the term for the category with more members that have fewer features in common is more generic, and the term for the subcategory with fewer members that have more in common is more specific. Specific terms are more precise than their generic counterparts. Since more precise terms imply a greater number of features in common, we can say that more precise terms convey more information than more general terms. We also saw that in spite of conveying different amounts of information, a generic term and a specific term can both be used to denote the same thing. If this is the case, does it really matter if we use one term or the other, if the person receiving our message can identify what we are talking about? The answer is, it might, because the words we use do more than just denote things and actions. They also convey information that helps us distinguish those things and actions from other things and actions. At the same time, they convey information about attitudes, relationships, and a whole lot more. This reality is important in translation because, in general, no category label in one language conveys exactly the same information as a category label in another language. This means that, as we translate, the words we choose in the target language are likely to convey information that is in some way different to what is conveyed by the words in the original language. As an example of this, let's think about translating the words for relatives we encountered in video 20. First, let's suppose you want to translate this sentence into English. Coming up with a way to express may is easy enough. The word conveys both the information that the person in question is a female sibling and that she is younger. Of course, translating this term into English requires using two English words for the one Mandarin word, because there is no single English word that conveys the same information that may conveys in Mandarin. Now suppose you want to translate the English sentence, "I saw Jane's sister," into Mandarin. Which Mandarin word would you choose for sister? Well, if we're talking about a particular sister, and I know this girl's age relative to Jane's, I can pick the appropriate term. But note that choosing either of these options involves indicating the relative age of the sister. When I do this, I am making something explicit in the text of the translation. This is information that was not stated explicitly in the text of the original. Does doing so mean that I am adding information to the message? Or can we say that even though the information that the sister is older or younger is not stated explicitly in the original English text, because the information is in the context, making it explicit in the translated text is okay? Note that in this case, the meanings of the Chinese words that mean sister force the translator to specify whether the sister is older or younger. So if using one of them is adding information to the translation, it is the semantics of the available words in the receptor language that requires the translator to do so. But what if the translator doesn't know if the sister in question is older or younger? He has no choice but to use one term or the other, and has a 50% chance of picking the wrong one. What does that mean for the integrity of the translation? Sometimes it's the grammar of the receptor language that forces the translator to make information explicit in the translation that is not explicit in the original text. In video 21, we considered the Tuyuka language, whose verbal system requires speakers to indicate how they came to know any information that is being asserted in the statements they produce. Since English grammar does not require speakers to include this information, it is missing from most English sentences. This creates a particular challenge when translating stories from English to Tuyuka. Can the translator really be expected to know how the author of the original story knows the information that is being asserted? Does including such information in a Tuyuka translation of an English story require the translator to add information to the story? Where might that information come from if the translator is ignorant of the original context? And if the original author did not bother to make that information explicit in English, does it really matter what the translator says? How can he be sure? What about when translating stories from Tuyuka to English? In this direction, it's not hard to include the information about how the narrator knows about the events and actions being recounted. The problem here is that for English speakers, making this information explicit in every sentence is not natural, and a story told like this seems to be emphasizing the wrong things. It's a good bet that a typical English speaker will enjoy a story a lot more if a lot of the information required by Tuyuka grammar is simply left out of the English translation. So what should the translator do? Explicitly reproduce all of the information in the original text, or leave some of that information implicit so that his readers will feel more at home? The grammar of different languages require that all kinds of other information be made explicit as well. In video 13, we saw how English requires speakers to indicate to listeners if they think that listeners will be able to uniquely identify the things they're talking about, while other languages do not. How should translators handle the inclusion of this kind of information? Does making those distinctions explicit in an English translation constitute adding information if they were not explicit in the original? Information is communicated not only by the words we use, but also by the order in which we use them. We've seen how different languages use word order to accomplish different things. English and many other languages use word order to indicate which roles the things being talked about play in the activities being described. We also noted that relative clauses and adjectives must often be moved or restructured to convey the right meaning. This means that to translate this information faithfully, the sequence of words in a translated text must usually be different from that of the words in the source text they are being used to translate. Languages, or the cultures that use them, often prefer that information be ordered differently on larger scales as well. We've seen that some cultures prefer to state conclusions before reasons, and others reasons before conclusions. In some cultures, temporal sequence must be strictly adhered to, so if an original text includes information that is not in chronological order, it must often be reordered in the translation to be understood by the receptor audience. In other cultures, all of a story's main characters must be introduced in the opening paragraph. It's obvious that to preserve the meaning of original texts, translators must often reorder the words that make up phrases and sentences. But what about the order of sentences, or even paragraphs? How much reordering can a translator do before a translation seems too little like the original to be considered a translation?